Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really complex and often contentious relationship, Islam and the West.
Yeah, and we're doing it by looking at a pretty fascinating source, a YouTube interview with Joram van Claveren.
Right. He's got such an unusual perspective, doesn't he? Former Dutch MP for the PVV, a right-wing party who then converted to Islam.
Exactly. So he brings insights from, well, both sides of that cultural conversation, you could say. And from his books, too, especially Forgotten Past.
And our goal here, for you listening, is to really unpack the key insights from this, get those aha moments, understand different angles, but keep it focused and clear.
We want to cut through the noise, basically. The interview itself asks a big question.
Will things ever improve between Islam and the West? That's the core of it.
And Van Claveren offers his take based on his own journey and, importantly, his historical research.
Okay, so let's dive in. One of the first big things he tackles is this common narrative, this idea of like 1,400 years of nonstop conflict.
He argues that's just, well, inaccurate. History shows periods of peaceful coexistence, even real collaboration.
And he points specifically to Al-Andalus, right? Islamic Spain and Portugal.
Which is fascinating because, while Europe was supposedly in the Dark Ages, the Iberian Peninsula under Muslim rule was having a golden age.
So advancements in science, math, medicine, a real flourishing of knowledge.
Absolutely. With Muslims, Christians, and Jews often working together, it completely undermines that simple conflict story.
And then closer to home for him, the Netherlands. This was really surprising.
Yeah, the idea of a mosque in Amsterdam as early as 1610.
I mean, they called it a synagogue for Mohammedans, apparently, for Morisco refugees, but still, 1610.
Before the Netherlands was even formally established as we know it, it suggests Islam isn't some recent import there.
He even mentions Muslims living way up north on Texel Island around that time, seemingly without much fuss.
Right, which directly challenges that argument, the Wesensvreemd, or essentially foreign argument that he himself used to make in politics.
And he admits now that, factually, claiming Islam is inherently foreign to Dutch history, it just doesn't stack up.
It's a powerful reassessment based on historical digging.
Okay, so beyond specific history, the conversation also gets into the common ground between the Abrahamic faiths.
Christianity, Islam, Judaism. He talks about a conversation he had with Tom de Neuser from a very strict Christian party, the SGP.
And finding unexpected commonalities there.
Well, yeah. Van Claveren explains how Islam views itself within that monotheistic tradition. It recognizes Jesus and Moses as prophets.
Which is different from, say, Jewish views on Jesus or Christian views on Muhammad.
Correct. But Islam positions itself as continuing that line of prophecy.
And despite those theological differences, there are shared values in daily life.
Definitely. He mentions overlaps, especially with more conservative Protestant views on ethics, family, that kind of thing. And Islam has this concept of al-Kitab.
The people of the book, referring to Jews and Christians.
Yeah, acknowledging that shared heritage. So there's this theological acceptance in principle.
But the reality is often conflict. So if it's not just theology, what else is driving it?
Geopolitics. Van Claveren really emphasizes this, especially the aftermath of World War I.
The collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. And then European powers basically redrawing the maps of the Middle East and Africa.
Creating these artificial borders.
Right, without much regard for the actual religious or tribal communities on the ground.
Which must have caused chaos.
Huge instability, internal tensions, fights over resources like oil. It reframes the conflict away from being purely about religion.
So he suggests maybe a more Marxist-influenced view, looking at economics and power struggles.
He touches on that, yeah. Suggesting socioeconomic disparities and power dynamics are often the root cause. And religion sometimes gets used as a justification or a tool in those fights.
It adds another layer, doesn't it? Beyond just faith versus faith.
Definitely. Which leads into the discussion about the feeling of a culture war in the Netherlands today.
A phrase used by the Dutch racism coordinator. Van Claveren agrees there's a cultural clash, even if not a literal war.
And he traces some of the negative views of Islam way back.
To figures like Martin Luther.
Yeah. Luther associated Islam with the Ottoman Empire, which was the big geopolitical enemy back then. He even called it, the religion of the devil.
Wow. That's heavy historical baggage.
And Van Claveren argues that kind of thinking still echoes, often unconsciously, in Western views today.
It makes you think about how deep these biases can run. He also mentions group identity, though, like historical conflicts between Catholics and Protestants.
Sure, that us versus them dynamic is always a factor in human societies.
But he adds a nuance, right? For people who believe in an absolute religious truth,
For them, the theological differences themselves carry immense weight. It's not just group identity politics. The core beliefs matter profoundly.
this connects to another fundamental tension he brings up: theocentric versus anthropocentric worldviews.
God-centered versus human-centered.
Mm.
Historically, Western societies were more theocentric, but secular liberalism is much more anthropocentric.
And that clash plays out in debates about, well, everything. Religion's role in society, family, raising kids, social norms.
Exactly. Fundamentally different starting points for how society should work.
And he critiques some on the right who defend the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Without actually being religious themselves, he calls it an empty shop window.
He uses that example of an imam protest on Easter being misinterpreted.
Yeah, twisted into an attack on Christianity, even bizarrely linked to Hitler's birthday. He sees it as projecting fear onto something misunderstood.
It shows how easily things can be distorted through a lens of suspicion.
Definitely. But the conversation doesn't shy away from criticisms of Islam either. It brings up Leigh Gould's experiences.
Right, the ex-Muslim writer who critiqued oppressive family environments.
And Van Claveren acknowledges those realities but makes a distinction.
Between negative cultural practices in some families and the actual core teachings of Islam.
Precisely. He stresses that for countless Muslims, faith is a voluntary choice. And he brings up the Quranic verse.
La ikraha fid-din.
There is no compulsion in religion, highlighting that principle of religious freedom within Islam itself.
Which contradicts the forced conversion narrative you sometimes hear.
He also points out, interestingly, that the detailed institutional structures of many religions aren't always laid out explicitly in the original texts. They evolve.
That's a good point. He also addresses common criticisms about women and LGBTQ+ issues.
Yeah, tackling those head on. He points to historical examples like Muhammad's first wife, Khadija.
A successful businesswoman.
Right, and Fatima al-Fihri, who founded the world's oldest university. Examples of empowered women early in Islamic history.
And the emphasis on mothers.
Huge emphasis. Sayings like paradise being under the feet of the mother, high status.
But what about extremist groups like ISIS? Their actions seem to contradict all that.
He condemns them unequivocally.
Yeah.
Says their behavior is completely contrary to Islamic principles. He mentions a book, Refuting ISIS, written by an Islamic scholar.
So there's internal critique within Islam against that extremism.
Absolutely. He draws a parallel, saying extremist acts have unfortunately been committed in the name of many religions throughout history.
And how does Islam view human nature itself? Is it inherently sinful?
Not inherently sinful like in some Christian interpretations with original sin, more like humans have the capacity for both good and evil.
And individuals are responsible for their choices.
Yes, guided by the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's example and practices.
Okay, let's shift to integration in the Netherlands, the history of guest workers from Turkey and Morocco.
A really important piece of the puzzle. Van Claveren points out that back in the 60s and 70s, the Dutch government didn't really have an integration plan.
It was mostly about economics, needing cheap labor.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And he argues that many subsequent challenges weren't primarily about religion, but socioeconomic factors.
Like education levels, or coming from rural backgrounds into an industrial society.
Exactly. He contrasts it with, say, the U.S., where Muslim communities often arrived with higher education levels and integrated differently.
So government policy, or lack thereof, played a big role.
He suggests a more proactive approach. Language training, education support could have made a big difference. He says many immigrants wanted to learn Dutch but weren't always given the chance or encouragement.
It's complex. He also touches on how Dutch culture itself has changed with immigration.
Acknowledging that for some people there's a feeling of loss for the old Netherlands. But he brings up Ella Vogeler's controversial comment.
Saying Islam is part of Dutch culture.
Yeah. And Van Claveren argues, based on that early history we discussed, that factually she had a point.
It definitely challenges fixed ideas of national identity.
For sure. Which brings us finally to Van Claveren's own story, his personal journey.
From KVV politician, fiercely anti-Islam, to converting, it's quite something.
He describes the PVV under Geert Wilders as almost sectarian. Like dissent wasn't tolerated. He felt like an outcast after leaving.
He tells that story about a current PVV member visiting his Islamic center secretly.
Yeah, shows the internal pressure. He also explains the PVV strategy.
The picket fence strategy.
pushing extreme proposals gradually to shift the whole debate on Islam over time. He mentioned Martin Bosba focusing everything early on. Are you for or against Islam? Just that one question.
And Van Claver initially shared those negative views?
Oh, yeah. Shaped by his conservative reform background, 9/11, Theo Van Gogh's murder, he actually set out to write an anti-Islam book.
And that's what led him the other way.
Ironically, yes. Researching for the book forced him to really examine Christian theology deeply, and he found questions he couldn't answer, especially around the Trinity.
And Islamic theology offered answers that made more sense to him.
He found it more logically consistent, he says. Plus, reading actual Islamic sources, not just books about Islam written by secular Westerners, gave him a totally different perspective.
Was there a specific moment, a turning point?
He describes opening the Quran randomly and reading a verse about hearts being blind, not eyes.
Wow.
And it just clicked. He realized his own prejudice, his emotional resistance, was blinding him to the intellectual conclusions he'd already reached.
So the conversion was driven by reason, not emotion, despite his initial feelings.
That's what he says. A reasoned argument won out. And because he was a public figure, he felt he had to share his story.
It's an incredible journey. So reflecting on all this, Van Claveren's story, the forgotten history, the complexities, it leaves you with a lot to think about.
Definitely. Which leads us to our final thought for you, the listener.
If, as Van Claveren suggests, centuries of connection and shared values between Islam and the West have been buried under conflict narratives, what other forgotten pasts might be shaping how we see different groups today?
And maybe more importantly, how could actively uncovering those alternative histories actually change our perspectives? Could it help build bridges where we currently only see walls? Something to ponder.